and lived from somewhere around 1365 to around 1430. And as is tradition for our calendar of saints, he died on January 29th. How we don't have an exact year but have a date, hard to figure out. But we've decided that he died somewhere around January 29th, and we celebrate our saints on the day of their death. So today we will remember Andrei Rublev, who was a monk and iconographer. There's some different chronologies of his life. Some say that he became a monk early in his life, and some say he became a monk late in his life. I don't know. There's no way to find out. Apparently, those monasteries don't have concrete records of the 1300s. Big surprise. But we do know where he was a monk. He was a monk at St. Sergius, and then in Andronikov in Moscow. So he was a monk 2 different places, and he studied under Theophanes the Great, who came to Russia from Constantinople. Iconography was big in Constantinople for centuries. So the practice sort of spread out from there, and now we know many iconographers who are from Russia. The Eastern Church uses a lot more icons than the Western Church, though we certainly use them as well. Some in the traditional style and some in a more modern style, which we'll get to as we go on. Some of Andrei Rublev's most revered icons are in the Dormition Cathedral in Vladimir, which is east of Moscow. And here's a couple of pictures, those top 2, of course, of the outside, just to give you a sense of the scope of this cathedral. It's huge, and a lot of it features Andrei Rublev's art. So just a couple pictures of those. The picture that's on the left is a little more detail of what you see on the left of that right picture. So it's a curved ceiling that has lots of different paintings working together. Iconographers don't sign their work, so the only way for us to know that a particular icon is done by a specific artist is if that church kept good record of who was doing all of the art, and also from tiny details in icons. As we go on, I'll explain some of the ways that iconography is sort of standardized. But still, every artist has slight differences, the way they do their brush strokes, tiny little things that people who study icons can tell you the difference between one iconographer and another. I don't have a trained eye for that, so I just trust experts to tell me that these were done by Andrei Rublev, but I just offer you that as a sort of caveat to all of this, that it's hard to know for certain, but historical record indicates that these are most likely Andrei Rublev. Also go back a slide and say this is one of his most famous icons of the Trinity. It's used often and has been used as inspiration for many other icons. And this is of an instance where the Trinity appeared to Abraham. So this is Andrei Rublev sort of reading between the lines in the Old Testament, and he saw the Trinity appearing in this way before we even knew Jesus as Jesus. So sort of creative interpretation in the icon. I'll say a little bit about the history of icons. I also just realized that I didn't start us with prayer, for which I apologize. I always start us with prayer, but let's back up a second. This morning on the handout, you'll see that we have a prayer both at the top and the bottom of the handout. That first prayer is what an iconographer would say before beginning an icon, and the last prayer is what an iconographer would say after finishing the icon. So we'll sort of bookend our time together in the same way. Is there someone who would be willing to read that prayer aloud for us? It's kind of long for us to do in unison. Great, thank you. Just up to that line.
O divine Lord of all that exists, thou hast illumined the apostle and evangelist Luke with thy Holy Spirit, thereby enabling him to represent thy most holy mother, the one who held thee in her arms and said, "The grace of him who has been born of me is spread through the world." Enlighten and direct my soul, my heart, and my spirit. Guide the hands of thine unworthy servant, so that I may worthily and perfectly portray thine icon, that of thy mother and all the saints, for the glory, joy, and adornment of thy holy church. Forgive my sins and the sins of those who will venerate these icons, and who, kneeling devoutly before them, give homage to those they represent. Protect them from all evil and instruct them with good counsel. This I ask through the intercession of thy most holy mother, the Apostle Luke, and all the saints. Amen.
Thank you. So this prayer invokes St. Luke because St. Luke, we think, is one of the first iconographers and painted several icons of the Holy Mother of Mary. There's at least 5 icons of Mary that are attributed to St. Luke. So iconography has been going on at least that long in the Christian tradition or in followers of Jesus that long, but iconography is shared across other religious traditions as well. It's not just specific to Christianity. But this is really the first sort of sacred art in the Christian tradition. And their icons are called windows into heaven. So they are really just spiritual art. It's not art in the sense that we think of it more broadly, where the skill of the painter is the primary thing that we're seeing. When we go to an art museum, we marvel at the painter who created that work of art. Iconographers are really attempting to give us a lens into the heavenly world. So you can tell a talented iconographer from a less experienced or less talented iconographer, certainly, but the primary goal is not to show who you are as an artist, but rather to show the saint that you are depicting. Special attention and favor was given to iconographers in the early Byzantine Empire. Artists who created icons were relieved of all taxes. So that gave special incentive to this art form. So basically, the government said, this is important enough that we will not tax icons and the sales of icons. So, sort of interesting. And that is part of how it gained as much traction as it did. Icons can include mosaics, frescoes, and panel icons. Panel icons are probably the things we are most familiar with. So those are small icons, probably around this size, that can be carried with you. So they're travel icons, ones that are painted on the walls of cathedrals. Of course, you have to enjoy them in that specific place. But many people realized they wanted these in their own homes or wanted them for protection and for the presence of a saint on their travels. So we also have panel icons. In the 7th and 8th century, there was a lot of debate about whether icons were acceptable or whether they were idolatry, whether worshiping through the use of icons was idolatry. So in the 7th and 8th century, the iconoclasts come up and they start destroying tons of icons. So it's a wonder that we have some of those early icons because many, many of them were destroyed. So there was an ecumenical council in Nicaea, the last of those councils. Nicaea is the same place where we receive our Nicene Creed. So an earlier ecumenical council helped to pull together the Nicene Creed and offer us a statement of our theology in that way. So if it sounds familiar, that's why. But the last ecumenical council in Nicaea confirmed that use of icons was a-okay, and in fact was a good thing for us to do as Christians. Then at the Reformation, some debate comes up about it again. Is use of icons too Catholic? Hard to say. Episcopalians use icons. There are many other Christian traditions who would say we shouldn't do that, but it hasn't been quite as dramatic as the iconoclasts of the 7th and 8th century since then. So this council said, continue using icons, and the churches indeed continued. The Eastern and Western churches still share this Byzantine style through the 12th century, and there's still people who are trained in that same style today. Of course, fewer of them. It's one of those art forms that has sort of lost traction over time. It's expensive, for one, to create an icon, especially as the mediums that are used for icons become less common. So you have to special order a lot of these things. You can't go to a normal craft store and get these items. A lot of that is because they're made with entirely natural materials. So it's lost some traction, but there are certainly still people who are trained in the traditional style. The purpose of icons, why does any of this matter? Why do we have icons at all? Icons are intended to be a lens into the spiritual realm as far as can be achieved with material means. So this is our best human attempt to give ourselves a lens into something that is beyond our full understanding. So the primary function of icons is spiritual, as I named previously. They're intended to be a depiction of an eternal image. So you'll notice that icons are not entirely realistic. They have a particular style that emphasizes different features that, particularly on clothing, you'll notice this, and I'll show some in a moment. You'll notice that there's lines that don't exactly mimic the way that shadows and highlights happen in real life. But using sacred geometry, we come up with this way of depicting icons that are intended to be an eternal image of that saint rather than just an image of exactly how they were in their earthly life. That also means that there's a standardization of iconography through the forms and colors. So you can buy books now, and people who do iconography now will use the same template for an icon that has been used for centuries. And the lines will all be the same. The colors for different pieces of clothing will be the same. So there's a symbolism that's been developed over the centuries for those icons and is used across different artists. In the same way that our biblical text offers us theology through words, icons offer us theology in line and color. So it's about the image of that saint, but also about something much bigger. Our full theology and understanding of God is represented in icons. An example of the use of early icons, St. John Chrysostom always kept an icon of St. Paul on his desk whenever he was reading from Paul's letters. So this was a way of invoking the presence of St. Paul as he studied his works, and there's stories of St. Paul speaking to St. John of Chrysostom in those sort of study sessions, that Paul would come alive in this icon and speak to him, speak directly to him. So it's a way of experiencing the presence of a saint in our prayer and study. I'll say a little bit about the process in a moment, but first, are there any questions about what I've said so far?
Are you going to show us some sacred geometry?
Sort of. I'll point it out in some icons that we look at. Did you have one as well?
Just real quick, how much did the Muslim invasions have to do with the changing of this type of art?
That's a good question, and I don't know specifics of that, but I will say that the mixing of religious traditions is part of how iconoclasm came to be, that there are other traditions that really questioned Christian use of icons. So then other Christians were like, oh, should we be doing this? Is this okay? So the influence of other religions and conflict between religions brought up this conflict within Christianity about the use of icons, which is sort of interesting. It's not a full answer to your question, but there definitely was some influence from other traditions, both in the use of icons and in the questions about whether we should have them. Anything else?
This discussion has brought up something that I hadn't thought about. I've always been interested in the first icons of Jesus. What were the first paintings and how did he look? But I never thought about other figures might have been first. And here I'm learning Mother Mary had the first icon, and then I wonder who else had early icons, if we know.
So what we know is that it's likely St. Luke also painted icons of some of the other apostles. So really, icons of Jesus weren't even in the first 5, we can assume. And I think, I'm guessing here, but I think part of the reason for that is that many people who saw Jesus in his earthly life considered him an icon of God. So Jesus in his human person is a lens into something spiritual and something bigger and grander. So I sort of wonder if early people thought, well, we already have an icon of Jesus. It was Jesus when he walked the earth. So let's make icons of some of these other figures. I can't be sure about that, but it is interesting, you're right, that Jesus was not the first focus of iconography, that in fact it was Mary that came first. Sort of surprising. It's not what we would guess.
I have a question related to icons versus descriptive panels that you might see in a sanctuary, in particular in cathedrals in Europe, for example.
Yeah.
My understanding is that, especially in Gothic era cathedrals, that a lot of panels describing, say, the Passion of Christ, not too dissimilar to what we show here in our church, were put there to help the illiterate understand the Gospels and the stories. How do you, maybe I walked in kind of late here, but how do you differentiate, if you do, the difference between an icon and just a panel that describes a scene? How would you make that distinction?
I think
if
different
one
people would
exists?
give you a different answer. What I would say is that iconography as a tradition speaks to a specific kind of art that has similarities throughout the centuries. But there's lots of other valid forms of religious art that are still helpful in our understanding of God. So I would say that any religious art could potentially be a lens into something godly and spiritual, but iconography as a tradition shares specific characteristics. You might call other art an icon in the sense that it offers a lens to God. It offers us a smaller picture of what might be happening on a more cosmic level. But as we look at a couple icons, you'll see that there's shared characteristics and there's a shared process and set of materials for this specific tradition. But there's lots of forms of religious art, as you point out. It's also worth noting that the Bible was not in the common vernacular of people for most of our history. For most of Christian history, the Bible was in Latin, and it was a huge deal that it started being printed in common vernacular. So it's true. I mean, many people couldn't read Latin. It's not what they spoke, and it was expensive to learn another language and to learn how to read at all. So those images that offer us some understanding of Jesus' story, of the full arc of the biblical narrative, were really important throughout history in a way that sometimes I think we take for granted because most of us can read the scriptures for ourselves. So thanks for pointing that piece out as well.
You mentioned that they were sold, and were they sold to the church or lay people or to the rich?
The rich, yes. I would imagine that churches would hire or commission iconographers for specific art, as we see in some of these cathedrals. But otherwise, icons that were purchased, they were expensive. So yes, it was for rich people of faith who wanted these for their homes and for their travels. Yeah.
One interpretation, I've studied this because iconography had a major impact on the silent Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, who was a communist, but he looked at that particular tradition of Russian imaging.
Yes.
And one interpretation was that you can have a picture which is a representation, but an icon is a direct connection with the divine being. So it's like talking to the divine being rather than just seeing that person's image. So it's like a direct path to it. So it's more sacred in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great articulation, and how many people who use icons in their regular pattern of worship would probably describe the difference. I'm perhaps more loose on the interpretation, knowing that many people use other forms of religious art as that lens, but I think you're right, that that's the purpose of iconography as a tradition, is that it's a direct path to that saint and to something that's spiritual. I'm going to move into talking about the process. And here I just have a list of the steps, but it's more interesting to go through and see them together. I apologize that these are not high-quality images. The website that I got them from that has lots of information about icons, if you're curious, monasteryicons.com. These are their images, and they're not even great quality on their website. So I apologize for that, but they do offer us a really great way to look at this step by step. And then I'll also show a time-lapse video of making an icon that I find really fascinating to watch. So icons that are made now, as I mentioned, there's books you can buy that have these templates for icons, and you use the same lines that have been used for centuries. So typically you'll put carbon paper underneath that template for an icon and trace it onto a gesso board. So it's a wooden board that's painted with a thick white paint. And you'll trace it on there, and then once it's been traced, you'll etch those lines. So as you etch them, the gesso is thick enough that it creates a divot in the board that then will be visible throughout your painting of the icon. So this means after you paint layers and layers and layers on the icon, you can still follow where you're going and know where the wrinkles in a tunic might be, so that then it still lines up as you move through the process. So if you see icons of the same saint, you'll notice that they're pretty similar across different artists, different people, depending on exactly how you mix a color. You might see variations in color. Different people offer their brushstrokes in a different way. So there's really small differences between the icons because you start with this template. So once it's etched into the board, then the next thing that happens is the gold leaf already. So that's an invitation of what is heavenly into the process. When I've done icons, I've written a couple of icons, and I didn't bring them this morning. Sorry about that. But I've done them where you start by putting clay bowl, which is a red clay, watered down, and that also has some holy oils in it. And that goes down first, and that's what the gold leaf sticks to. When I've done these, it was in Texas during seminary. Austin is pretty humid, so that makes gold leaf sort of difficult, but we did it. It makes it stick to the board pretty well, but it also sticks to everything else that you're working with. So you put down the clay bowl or another sticky substance. Some people will use rabbit glue. I mean, there's lots of different ways that people do this. But you'll lay down the gold leaf and then burnish it so that it sticks really well, and you can't see the differences between the different sheets of gold leaf that you've put on there. It just becomes this really magnificent gold surface behind your icon. And you do that before you even touch paint. Again, an invitation of the heavenly into the process. The next thing is to trace the halo. In my experience, this is the most difficult part of writing an icon. You use a compass and red vermilion paint to create this perfect circle, or as perfect as we can achieve as humans, around the halo of the icon. And then you start painting layers and layers. Icons are achieved through a layering of thin paint that is made from natural elements. So all of this is natural paint. It's using egg tempera and pigments that are all of natural origin. So you start with all the darker layers. You can see this is an icon of John the Baptist that we're looking at. It starts out really dark. Those first layers will offer the shadows as you work through the icon. For many icons, for the skin, you start with a sort of olive green that then, the first time I did this, I was like, there's no way. But my teacher has told me to do something wrong. I don't know what's happening. This looks like an alien. But when you start with that olive and add the layers over top, it gives the skin an olive tint so that it's not just a super whitewashed John the Baptist. That's not what we're going for. So you start with those dark layers that then as you build up, it gives some dimension to the icon. But it looks different than how I think about painting. I normally paint with acrylic, which is not transparent. So I'm used to adding the darker layers on top. So for me, this was really a surprising way to go about painting. But you start with the dark layers, and then progressively add brighter layers, lighter colors. And as you paint, each layer covers less of the icon, so that the darker pieces are left to allow shadows in the icon. And then when you get to the end, you start using a pure white paint to have just tiny little highlights in the icon. And then the last step is always lettering. So that can be lettering on a scroll. Many icons have a scroll that has a quotation from that saint. Or you'll add lettering over the top of the icon that has the name of that saint. And then you're done with the creation part. And then icons are blessed. They also typically are covered with oil. You have to wait for them to dry for weeks to ensure that all of it is fully adhered to the board. And then you can oil it, which is a terrifying process to dump oil over something you've spent days or weeks creating. But that's what you do, and that oil, when you rub it over the icon, then protects the paint for years to come. So part of the reason that we have some of these old icons is because they're really well preserved. This process of putting oil over top of the icons works pretty well. So that's the last step. It's blessed, and then you can pray before it or offer it to another person. I'll say some about the rules of iconography, but it's named that you, as the person who write the icon, are supposed to be the first person to pray before it, before anyone else can. I'll offer this time lapse for y'all, just a couple minutes, a time lapse painting of Saint Melanie. So you'll see they're starting with those darker layers. Oh, ads. And then getting progressively lighter, and you can see that they're taking up less space with those lighter layers. I will say I'm surprised that the skin has not been touched yet. Normally that would be the first layer of paint would include the skin. But this person I'm sure is a professional, so I'll trust them. So you see they're starting with that darker olive complexion and then building up on top of it. And you'll notice this artist is being particularly careful to make sure the oils of their skin don't get onto the icon, so they have that paper between them and the icon as they paint, which helps to make sure nothing will smear as they work. So the lettering, again, is that last piece of the process and makes the icon unique to that saint. Many icons hold objects that are significant to their ministry or have a scroll with a quote on them. And you'll see that gold even on a picture in a video is really vibrant, really bright and easy to see.
Adeline, I just a question. You've used the word write, and I was just going to point that out, and I appreciate you doing that because you don't paint an icon, you write an icon, which is just an interesting, I've always thought, curious.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to explain that, why.
I wish I could. That's just the tradition of iconography, and I think part of naming it as writing an icon versus painting an icon is, again, it's a different practice than a painter of another tradition, because you're allowing the saint to come through this piece of art that you are creating, but it's not about the artist. Icons aren't signed. You don't know who the artist is except for those tiny details that might be specific to a particular iconographer. But it's a really different way of painting. So it's not named as painting because it's really, the saint is coming through and you're just putting some paint on a board and allowing the saint to speak and to come into our vision. So it's a different way of understanding the art form. Mm-hmm.
Icono things, were they tracing off prior ones to be representational? It would seem like it would limit their creative process.
Exactly. It does, if you want to think about it that way.
Well, then why would we
Early,
call them artists then?
a good question. Early iconographers would have been creating these templates, and over the generations, people used templates rather than just creating their own image of the icon. Iconography is still really hard. Even if, like, I say tracing the icon and then filling it in. I mean, it sounds like paint by numbers, but it's actually a really hard craft to get good at, because you have to have a real knowledge of the materials that you're working with and how they work together. You really have to surrender yourself to the process of prayer with the icon for it to show forth. So it is a particular artistry and something that takes years for people to fully cultivate. So it on the one hand, it sounds simple, and it sounds like we're all just painting the same thing over the centuries. And in a sense, that's true. The rules of it are pretty simple. But the ability to master it is an entirely different thing. And that's where those early painters of icons did study more of the sacred geometry that I really don't know a whole lot about. But they studied it and wanted the proportions of the icons to mirror specific things, and wanted the number of lines to line up with specific things. So a lot of work went into creating those templates that then are shared through the generations and allow this to be a real generational practice, not something that's just about a particular artist. Yes. Yes, so there are still people who are professional iconographers, and you can purchase icons that are made today, not just reproductions that are printed. So there are people for whom this is still their life's work. And there's also people like me who have gone to icon writing retreats. I would say I did a fine job, but if I spent years and years learning the craft, I could have done a better job. So there's also ways that novices can engage in the craft too.
So does the image flow through the circular window of heaven, the halo, as a manifestation and coalescing of the divine light? Is that
Yes.
the geometry?
Yes, that's exactly right. So the saint is showing forth. That's why you start with the gold and the halo. That's intended to be a lens into heaven. So that's a piece of the sacred geometry. And then there are also pieces that relate to the specific lines, which again, I'm not an expert on. But those early iconographers were thinking about that. I could certainly do research on the specifics of that, but I don't know the details.
Okay, so the template is the foundation, the uniformity of the images.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there's probably not an answer to this, but I was wondering how they might come to the final decision about what the template actually is.
It's a good question. And early icons have a lot more variance. And then it becomes clear that certain people are teaching iconographers of the next generation. So I think some of it is just who becomes the teacher and starts offering those through the generations. I don't think they all sat down with their various icons and said, I think A is the one we should go with. No, I think C is the one we should go with. I think just over the generations, depending on who the teacher was. And there's still, you can find a few icons for different people. There's not just one for different saints. So you can just see how it's sort of filtered through apprenticeship, really. That's a good question. The question is, did Buddhists also do this? Other religious traditions have icons. They would identify a different way of doing them and probably a different definition for what makes an icon versus another form of religious art. But there are other traditions who do things like this. Yeah. I'll let you read the rules for iconography, just because we're short on time. But you'll notice in reading those that it's a process of prayer. It's a process of allowing God to invite you into that process and for God to lead you in that process. It's not just about your own work. I love the line, it's in the middle line, second from the left. Do not be jealous of your neighbor's work. Their success is your success too. And when I did my first icon writing retreat, that was probably my primary takeaway. Of course, I created this beautiful icon that is really significant to me now. But these rules of iconography can really be rules of life, too. In some ways, you have to interpret them. It's not literal as it applies to your life, except for perhaps that one about jealousy of your neighbor's work. That it's a significant thing to applaud the work of your neighbor and recognize that the success of the whole is important. It's not about you only as an individual. So there's some rules for life in there, I think, too. I've sort of named these as we've gone through. The traditional iconography does have age-old techniques and styles, a prescribed set of lines. There's standardized images used to depict saints, specific ways of painting. The order of the steps is the same across people. The kinds of materials are the same across different people. So the differences between one icon and the next are pretty small. So these are really traditional icons that we would think of. You see the full gold background. You see a similar style of lettering. They would be done with the same process that we've talked through. And you'll see, particularly on the clothes on the right side, you can see how there's lines around the wrinkles in that tunic that are not exactly what our clothes look like in real life. The highlights on our clothing don't turn that sort of color or have that sort of sharpness. Even with the most starched shirt, it doesn't look like this. But that's part of the style, that there's those clean lines around things. It's really defined. And the highlights and the shapes that create them, that's something that's specific to the individual artist. So that the lines are all in the same place that you're following around, but the way that a person chooses to highlight specific pieces does vary. So that's the traditional style. There's also a tradition of modern iconography, which probably early iconographers would say is trash, but that's okay. So there are people who also practice a tradition of iconography where they probably have learned enough of the rules of traditional iconography to break them, which is kind of fun too. I mean, there's something spiritual and significant in that as well. So some of that comes through in having modern saints depicted or a modern way of looking at an ancient saint. They vary from different people, including the way that they're painted, the materials that are used, and those you can more readily identify the artist. So I'll show you some of those. Kelly Lattimore is a prolific icon painter today, and you can go to a retreat with Kelly Lattimore. You can do icon painting in this style, which you'll see offers modern depictions. Up there on the right, you'll see that this is a sort of a mirror of Rublev's icon of the Trinity, but taken into a sort of new age. So the people have a little more specificity in terms of their race and the way that they're dressed. You'll see that the table in front of them has a rainbow flag on it. I mean, it embraces different elements and highlights different things. Over on the left is the Holy Family of the Streets, so reminding us that Jesus and his family were homeless at Jesus' birth. So just highlighting different ways of understanding the saints and how they offer us an image of God. I really like this one on the bottom, too, that you have a traditional depiction of Our Lady, except for that she's wearing a sweatshirt and jeans, but the colors really mimic a traditional icon of her. And then she's placed into this larger icon of the family. So different ways to depict things. Modern Saints by Gracie is another person who's a really prolific icon painter that offers some icons that some people would probably take great issue with, but I really love them. I think they offer me a different way to understand saints. So over there on the left, you have Joan of Arc. Then in the center is St. Clare and St. Francis. And then on the right, you have John the Baptist. So these are ways that she's depicted different saints that I think invite us into an entirely new way of thinking. So I think she might take delight in the fact that these icons are somewhat controversial in the Christian community. And then finally, Gabriel Garcia Roman has lots of different icons that I think are really beautiful. And this one is a series of queer icons, some well-known and some unknown, or certainly known to the artist. But again, a different way of imagining modern people as saints, and an entirely different form of iconography, though you can see there's things borrowed from the traditional form. They have this perfectly round halo and sort of pop off the page, but using photography as the primary medium there. So people have taken it into a new age and adapted the craft and used just enough of the rules to know how to break them and borrow from the ancient tradition while bringing us something modern. I would not think that they used natural medium, no. I would not assume that. I'm going to close us with prayer for sake of time. I do have to run to the next service. But certainly, I'm glad to answer further questions you have about iconography. The icons that I've written are in my office, so you're welcome to stop by and peek at those in the next couple of weeks. I love icons, so glad to answer more questions. But for now, let's pray. Thou thyself, O Lord, art the fulfillment and the completion of all good things. Fill my soul with joy and gladness, for thou alone art the lover of mankind. Let thy grace sanctify and dwell within this icon, that it may edify and inspire those who gaze upon it and venerate it, that in glorifying the one depicted, they may be repentant of their sins and strengthened against every attack of the adversary. Through the prayers of the Theotokos, the holy apostle and evangelist Luke, and all the saints, O Savior, save us. Amen. Thank you all for being here.